Well, I want to thank you for that, and thanks everybody for coming in today. You know, my uh, the the new book I have out now, "Live Not by Lies." I've dedicated it to the memory of a Catholic priest, Father Tomislav Kolakovich. If you've read the book, you know who he is, but briefly, I'll just explain that he was doing anti-Nazi work in Croatia, in Zagreb, in the 1940s when he got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him. He slipped away, moved to Slovakia, his mother's homeland, and began teaching in a Catholic university there. He told his students that the good news is the Germans are going to lose this war, but the bad news is the Soviets are going to be ruling us when it's over, and the first thing they're going to do is come after the church. We have to be ready. So what he did was put together these small prayer groups, but not just prayer groups, groups of faithful Christians who were prepared to stand by each other when persecution came, and who laid the groundwork for the underground church in getting ready for this time of persecution. The Catholic bishops of Slovakia told him that, he's being an alarmist, it'll never happen here. But Father Kolakovich knew the Soviet mindset, and he knew how they worked. And he didn't, so he kept on pressing on, forming these small groups and these networks of groups. And sure enough, when the Iron Curtain came down, the first thing the communists did was went after the church. But the people, the faithful laity and the priest who had taken Father Kolakovich seriously, they were ready for it. And the reason that there was a Catholic church survived in Slovakia has a lot to do with Father Kolakovich. I bring him up at the start of this talk simply to say that what you're doing now as Orthodox homeschoolers is something like what Father Kolakovich did. I'm convinced of that. This is what all of us have to do, not just Orthodox Christians, all Christians who want the faith to survive through these difficult times we're in now and the difficult times ahead, have got to form these small intentional groups, whether they're homeschoolers or coming together for some other reason, and network among ourselves so we can have the infrastructure in place to withstand persecution. I'll talk a little more about that in tomorrow's talk. But today I'm going to talk about the importance of cultural memory. In 1939, Nazi forces invaded Poland, quickly overwhelming the Polish army. They established totalitarian rule in this occupied country. The Nazis viewed the Polish people and all Slavs as subhuman. They had nothing but contempt for them. Their plan was to subjugate Poland by erasing from the collective memory of the Polish people all sense of the two things that made Poles Poles. First of all, their Christian faith, and secondly, their sense of themselves as a distinct people. Now, in a totalitarian state, this is easier to do than you might think. All you have to do is suppress religious worship, gain control of the education system to regulate what goes into the heads of the next generation, gain control of the media to regulate what gets talked about in public, and to punish everyone who doesn't conform. In time, those who remember the old ways will die out. Their children, and especially their grandchildren, will have been formed by the new system with a new set of memories supplied by the totalitarians. By gaining control of cultural memory, the totalitarians will gain control of a culture and wipe it out. Well, in Nazi-occupied Krakow, a Catholic theater student named Karol Wojtyła and his friends decided to mount a special kind of resistance to the new totalitarianism. Now, it would have been pointless to take up arms against the German occupiers. The Wehrmacht had overwhelming force. What Wojtyła, the future Pope St. John Paul II, and his friends undertook was a very different kind of resistance. They had no way of knowing when the Nazi yoke would be lifted from their country, but they knew that it was their responsibility to keep memory of what it meant to be a Pole alive, to keep that memory blazing in the minds of the people, the Polish people, through this dark age. So Wojtyła and his theatrical companions wrote and performed plays about Polish patriotism and about the Catholic faith. They performed them in secret underground theaters. Had the Gestapo discovered them and their audiences, they would have imprisoned or killed everybody who was present for these plays. Now, these plays were not performances meant to break the tedium of life under German occupation. They were nothing less than attempts to save the life and the faith of the Polish nation by preserving its cultural memory, that is, its memory of what it meant to be a Pole. I first heard this story about Karol Wojtyła 5 or 6 years ago when I began working on my book, The Benedict Option. I had been talking to my friend Michael Hanby, a Catholic philosopher in Washington, asking for his advice because he's a really smart cultural critic. Well, he told me the story I just related to you, and he said to me that I needed to tell my readers to do as Wojtyła did. That's the most important thing today, said Michael Hanby. Well, what did he mean by that? He meant that, well, I should say that we aren't under occupation by the Nazis or by communists today. We can still worship freely. We can still teach our kids in the schools of our choice or even homeschool. We can buy whatever books we like and so forth. So what did Hanby mean? Why should Christians today in America undertake measures to save cultural memory? Well, the answer became clearer to me when I started researching my last book, Live Not by Lies. I went to a place in the far southern suburbs of Moscow called Butovo Field. Butovo Field is where the KGB, in one 14-month period, massacred 21,000 political prisoners, including many Orthodox priests and bishops. Today, Butovo Field is a memorial for all the victims of political violence in Russia. The Russian government also, I think this was in around 2006, built a church nearby to honor the memory of the martyrs of Bolshevism. I had come to Butovo Field on that day in November to meet Father Kirill Kaleda, the priest who was responsible for convincing the Russian government to set aside this killing field as a memorial to the martyrs and other victims of the communists. He knew that if there was not a place set aside and hallowed to that memory, that the people of Russia might forget. Well, Father Kirill came into the kitchen of his Butovo office to meet me from a visit he had made to a nearby school. I had arrived there on the national holiday set aside to honor all the victims of political violence. And Father Kirill had gone to a local school that day to give a lecture about what had been done right there in Butovo Field, right there in their own town. He was really shaken up when he came in to see me, Father Kirill was. He said that the students he addressed had no idea what he was talking about. The memory of what happened at Butovo Field was not part of their cultural recollection, even though the National Memorial was right there in their own backyard. How does something like that happen? I mean, this is not like something that happened 400 years ago. This happened within the communist regime, existed well within living memory of the Russians living today. And there were still people alive in Russia who were alive at the time of the massacres there. But the young people there today knew nothing about it. A similar thing came to mind when I was in Poland doing research for the book. I discovered to my shock that Christianity in Poland is in real trouble, this in the land of St. John Paul. Young Catholics there told me that they expect within 10 years for their country to be just like Ireland, a place that was once fervently Catholic, but now has gone secular. I found this so hard to believe because I'm 54 years old. I came up in the period when John Paul was leading from Rome, leading the opposition to the communist government, and was a real hero for all anti-communists. So how did it happen that, within a generation of his passing, less than a generation of his passing, Poland had become so fragile? Well, one of the things I learned, not only from talking to younger people, but talking to older Catholic priests, is that the Poles who survived communism, many of them did not want to burden their children, the children who were born after the fall of communism, with these dark and heavy memories of the past. They believed that to secure a prosperous and a happy future for their kids, they had to keep their children from looking back to the dark days of the communist past. You can understand why they might feel that way. But by doing that, they also deprived their children of the memories of Poland's long history as a nation, and deprived their children of these necessary memories of Poland's Christian identity. I found the same thing in other post-communist countries. In Hungary, a young Catholic woman who was born right after the fall of communism, lamented that the only thing her generation wanted for their nation was for it to become just like Sweden, rich, hedonistic, and godless. An older man I interviewed on that same trip sighed that what neither the occupying Nazis nor the communists could do, erase Hungary's cultural memory, liberal democratic capitalism has done over the last 30 years. Now, that man is a Christian who hated communism. He was a Democrat who wanted capitalism, wanted all of these things that the communists had denied them. But he was devastated by this tragedy, the tragedy of what it means to be free in the modern West. What has happened to the post-communist youth in his country has also, to a great extent, happened to American youth. Today, I want to talk about what cultural memory is, why it's important, and the role that Orthodox Christian homeschoolers have to play in preserving it in the hearts and minds of our children. What is the past? True, it's everything that happened before this moment, but that definition doesn't get us very far. In a practical sense, the past is what we choose to remember from all the events that happened before this moment, starting 30 minutes ago all the way to 2,000, 3,000 years ago. That is the past. So think of yourself and your own identity. Your memories constitute most of your identity. They're your memories of what happened to you, but also the memories of things that happened to your family, to your community, and to your nation. All of us in this room are Christians, so our identities are founded on the memory of what happened to the ancient Hebrews as recorded in the Old Testament, and what happened when God became man in Jesus of Nazareth as recorded in the New Testament. All of the things that happened to the church after Christ's ascension into heaven are also part of our identities because they were handed down to us by our parents, by the church, and by Christian culture. No person and no culture can remember everything. A culture's memory consists of the stories, the events, the people, and other phenomena that a society chooses to remember as the building blocks of its collective identity. A nation's gods, its heroes, its villains, its landmarks, its art, its music, its holidays, all of these things are part of its cultural memory. It's how we know who we are, and it's how we know what we're supposed to do. Well, it doesn't take much to break that chain of remembrance. I remember once I was interviewing the art professor and cultural critic Camille Paglia, who told me how frustrating it was for her as a teacher of art to deal with the collapse of Christianity in the United States. Well, I asked her, what could you possibly mean by that? You're an atheist. Why do you care about religion? She said, well, you're right about that. I don't really care about religion itself, but I do care about art. And you can't understand Western art of the past 2,000 years if you don't know anything about Christianity, she said. She told me that just about the only students she has today who know anything about the Christian story are her Black students. Now, Camille Paglia teaches in Philadelphia, so I bet you that most of her students come from homes that identify as Christian, however nominally. But they did not pass on Christianity as a culture and as a cultural memory to their kids. In the next generation, it's going to cease to exist at all. A Russian historian told me in his Moscow apartment when I was over there researching Live Not by Lies, that the Soviet government's full-throated attack on religion and on the historical memory of the Russian people was so devastating that only a few decades after the revolution, very few people in Russia who had not lived through pre-revolutionary times had any memory at all of what Russia had been like before communism. Along those same lines, the historian Orlando Figes, who's one of the top historians in the West of Russia, says that those who came of age in Russia after the 1917 revolution, he said of those people, quote, for anyone below the age of 30 who had only ever known the Soviet world or had inherited no other values from his family, it was almost impossible to step outside the propaganda system and question its political principles, close quote. So you see why cultural memory is important. Without it, you have no way to know when you're being manipulated and tyrannized, when something valuable is being taken away from you. The The communists knew that if you deny people a cultural memory, you can turn them into blank slates onto which you can write whatever you like. The more totalitarian a regime's nature, the more it will try to force people to forget their cultural memories, the traditions handed on to them. In 1984, the Orwell novel, the role of Winston Smith, with the hero within the Ministry of Information, is to erase all newspaper records of past events to reflect the current political priorities of the ruling party. This, said the ex-communist Polish intellectual Leszek Kolakowski, reflects the great ambition of totalitarianism, total possession and total control of human memory. Kolakowski said, "Let us consider what happens when this ideal has been effectively achieved. People remember only what they are taught to remember today, and the content of their memory changes overnight if needed." Well, when you understand how this sort of thing works, you begin to see how sinister is the current ideological revolution in contemporary education. In British universities, activists have gained control of those institutions and are putting into place what they call a decolonization of the curriculum. This means that they are driving old white European males out of the curriculum in favor of women and people of color from other cultures and other civilizations. What this means in effect is the forced erasure of the cultural memory of the British, of Europeans, of the Greco-Romans, and of the West. It is, perversely enough, a recolonization of British culture by foreign cultures. It's the craziest thing. And this shows you also how the totalitarians, these would-be totalitarians today, use and misuse language to get what they want. Well, the same thing is underway in American universities, usually under the name of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Within the field of classics, for example, there's a rising movement to hold the Greeks and the Romans responsible for racism and white supremacy. Some of the academic leaders in the field want to destroy the field of classics. One of these leaders, in fact, is on the classics faculty at Princeton. It's just an incredible thing to think about that one of the best universities in the world, Princeton, has on its faculty a professor who openly says he wants to destroy the field. But this is how decadent our institutions are today. What they're up to is all about annihilating cultural memory. Another example recently, Amazon.com controls about 80% of the retail book market in the United States. Recently, they decided to stop selling my friend Ryan T. Anderson's book about transgenderism. Ryan Anderson is a leading Catholic public intellectual based in Washington. He heads up the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And 2 or 3 years ago, he wrote a really intelligent, logically argued, well-spoken book critical of transgender ideology. It was not one of these screaming propaganda tracts. He's a real scholar. Well, Amazon decided to stop selling it and said that they're not going to sell any book that puts down transgenders. Well, Ryan's book doesn't do that. Ryan's book challenges this ideology, but Ryan doesn't insult anybody in the book. The point is, Amazon said it's not going to sell the book. Well, Amazon has the freedom not to sell the book, but because Amazon controls so much of the book industry in this country, if Amazon says it will not publish a certain kind of books that are critical of transgenderism, then those books won't get published, period, because no publisher can afford to take that chance. This is how a certain way in which Amazon, by using its freedom and our democracy, its freedom to sell what it wants to sell, is serving the role of annihilating cultural memory. We will soon enough be in a situation where nobody alive remembers what it was like to live in a world where men were men and women were women. I mean, it sounds almost comical, but I assure you, there's nothing comical about any of this. They know very well what they're doing. Well, this movement to obliterate cultural memory is going to shape the rest of this century in America. Elites determine what must be remembered to gain access to their professional circles. Those who don't remember what they're told to remember will be excluded. And there will be historical lies told for the sake of advancing progressive politics. There already are. The 1619 Project is an attempt by the New York Times to reframe our understanding of America through teaching people that the entire purpose of the American Revolution was to protect slaveholders. It is not true, and it is not even close to true. Of course, we held slaves. People held slaves back in revolutionary America, but that was not the purpose of the revolution. That's not what the 1619 Project says. That project won the Pulitzer Prize and has been optioned by Oprah Winfrey's production company to serve as the basis for historical dramas and other forms of entertainment. Well, this shows you how it's not just what universities and schools teach us that forms a culture's memory. It's also in popular entertainment. It is probably more important that the 1619 Project is going to be taught by Oprah Winfrey's production company than that it has been taken up in 5,000 or more schools around the country, which it has been. This is something, though, the entertainment part of it, it's something that eludes most people. But this is something that all of us have to be aware of as Christian parents. Let me be philosophical for a second. The essence of modernity, of modern times, is to deny that there are any transcendent stories, structures, habits, or beliefs to which individuals must submit and that should bind our conduct. To be modern is to be free to choose as an individual. What is chosen doesn't really matter. The meaning is the choice itself. There is no sacred order in modernity. There's no other world. There are no fixed virtues, no permanent truths. There is only here and now and the eternal flame of human desire. I want, therefore I am. We don't believe that as Orthodox Christians, but that is the basis of the culture that we have handed on to the young today. This is why Generation Z is the first one in American history in which fewer than half of its members say they belong to a particular church or a religious tradition. Fewer than half. This is going to be the first generation in American history where fewer than half say they're Christian. And it doesn't mean that that's not because we've imported a bunch of Muslims or Hindus or Buddhists. It's because people are falling away from the faith. And it doesn't mean either that they're atheist. Rather, their belief is a sort of do-it-yourself, watery spirituality, picking and choosing from a variety of vague beliefs and practices. Again, remember, what is chosen doesn't matter. For them, the meaning is in the choice itself. Now, this is something they've learned from living in modern America, where individual liberty and consumer choice has become the greatest good. Christians today, people like me and you, find it difficult to pass the faith on to our children, in large part because all of us have become habituated to a way of life in which there are few, if any, shared beliefs and customs that transcend individualism. To those who want to keep cultural memory alive, it is not enough to pass on historical information to the young, to make them memorize dates and events. The truths carried by our traditions must be lived out subjectively. That is to say, they must not only be studied, but also embodied in shared social practices, words, of course, but also in deeds. Communities must have living models of men and women who enact these truths in their daily lives. Nothing else works. That's the only way we're going to be able to preserve our cultural memory and pass it on. So what does that mean concretely for Orthodox Christian homeschoolers? Well, first, it's critically important that you all understand what you're up against, what we are up against. We do not live in a neutral world, in a world that is neutral about Christianity. We live in a world in which those who control the means of cultural production, academia, the media, Hollywood, and so forth, and especially corporate America, maybe I can get into that some tomorrow, they are at best indifferent to what we believe and at worst hostile to it. I met a man last fall in Nashville, a Protestant pastor at a mega church in Portland, Oregon. And he told me, because, oh, you're Rod Dreher. Well, I just want to tell you that when the Benedict option came out in 2017, a lot of people in my circles were reading it and said, oh, he's being alarmist. It'll never get that bad. And he said, now, though, living in Portland, we're seeing that there's no other way forward except the Benedict option. And he said, the rest of America is going to face sooner or later what we're dealing with in Portland. That's really true. We are not facing Nazi tyrants or communist despots, but we are facing a softer form of totalitarianism. We're facing a world that tries to achieve the same things by using softer methods. They want to eradicate the cultural memory of Orthodox Christians, big O and small o, and of Western traditions and of traditional sources of meaning. Well, we will not keep this cultural memory that sustains us alive through half-hearted methods. We are fighting for our cultural and religious lives against a machine that wants to erase them in the name of progress, in the name of compassion, in the name of diversity, inclusivity, and equity. These are the new watchwords of the soft totalitarianism. Second, let us learn from what dissidents under communism did to keep memory alive, that is, to keep themselves and their children from forgetting who they were. In both the Benedict option and Live Not by Lies, I talk about the Benda family of Prague. The Bendas are Catholics, and they were the only Christians, the leaders of the family, Václav Benda and his wife Camilla, were the only Christians in the inner circle of the top Czech dissidents around Václav Havel. They didn't homeschool because that was illegal under communism, but both Václav and Camilla Benda knew that they had a responsibility all the same as the primary educators for their children to form the souls, the hearts, the minds, and the souls of those kids. When the Benda kids would come home from the communist schools, their parents would talk with them about what they had learned that day and point out to them where the truth came in and where lies came in. Well, this is not something, thank God, that you homeschoolers have to worry about. But the Bendas also talked to their kids all the time about what was going on in society around them, on the streets, in the media, and helping them how to learn to discern good from evil. They did not keep those kids completely sheltered because they couldn't. They knew that these kids, if they were going to survive as Christians in this communist society, they had to have some inoculation against the outside world. They had to know something of the outside world. But what they did was to, as I said, to talk to their kids about what was going on there and really engage with them in discussions of the world they lived in. None of us parents today can avoid doing this with our kids too, because our children are formed by the culture. If we're not curating our children's access to the culture, then we're turning them over to forces more powerful than ourselves. Now, I'm not talking about shutting our kids completely off from culture, though honestly, you cannot let your kids have smartphones, and you really have to heavily regulate their access to the internet. The Bendas didn't cut their kids off from culture. They raised their kids in the 70s and 80s, before and the internet and all that, but they didn't cut their kids completely off from culture. Rather, they used the best in culture to educate their children. For example, they would show the famous 1950s Western High Noon to their kids, and they would talk to them about it, about what was happening on screen and what the characters were doing, because they believed that this movie modeled what how a brave man behaves even when the whole world is against him, or at least won't help him. When I was interviewing the Benda children, all of whom are in middle age now, about their childhood, I was really struck by how much of an educational impression High Noon, that movie High Noon, made on them. They're still talking about it today and showing it to their own kids as part of their children's moral and aesthetic and cultural education. I would encourage you to consider how watching movies like that, high quality movies like that, with your kids and talking with them about it can educate them morally. The Bendas knew that it wasn't enough to point out to their children what was bad in the world. They also had to show them what was good. Viewing high quality old movies with them was one way, reading was another. Camilla read to her 6 children for 2 hours each day, even when her husband was in prison for his dissident activities, and she had to raise 6 kids on her own, even though she was also working a job. She's a philosophy professor. I asked Camilla what she read to her kids. She told me the myths, the classics, classic literature, things you couldn't get in communist schools, and a lot of Tolkien. Why Tolkien? I asked her. And she said, because we knew that Mordor was real. She went on to explain that she couldn't expect her children, as young as they were, to understand the complexities of what their parents were involved in, the dissident movement. But the kids could understand what the Fellowship of the Ring was, what it was about, and what it meant to commit yourself to a grand mission with your brothers and sisters, a mission that could cost you your life, but something you had to do to serve the good. This is how that Christian family laid the groundwork to raise little dissidents themselves, to educate their children in spite of the communist schools and in spite of the anti-Christian world and society all around them. Now, the Bendas also hosted in their apartment in central Prague seminars for adults where they could get together to talk about art, literature, and topics not allowed in communist society. The reason for these seminars was this: they wanted to help the Czech people remember who they were. This is something that homeschooling parents in America today can't neglect, to educate ourselves so that we can pass it on to our children. The story they always tell when you're in an airplane, if the oxygen mask pops out of the top, you have to put it on yourself before you put it on your kids. Educating kids today to be countercultural Christians requires also us parents educating ourselves. For me, it's incredible that my first exposure to the Odyssey and to Dante's Divine Comedy came when the oldest of my kids got it in his classical Christian school. It had never been part of my childhood or my education. And so I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity, because my wife and I chose to be countercultural schoolers, first homeschoolers, and then putting our kids in a hybrid school that's part homeschool, part classroom instruction. It served to educate me, and I ended up writing a book about discovering Dante. Anyway, third, I don't know how many of you are following a classical homeschool curriculum, one that emphasizes in particular learning from the Greco-Roman past. If you don't, I strongly urge you to consider it, or at least to make sure that your kids are learning a lot about Western history, because this is not something that is happening in an increasing number of public schools, nor in many private ones, in the grips of this new ideology. American society, certainly elite society, and what happens in the elites eventually settles down to the common people. American society is engaged in a collective act of consigning the memory of what it means to be us, to be Americans, to damnation. Teaching your children about our past, our collective past, the history, the art, the religion, the music, all of it is an act of countercultural rebellion and is an act of cultural survival. I think it's important to help our kids understand that there are always going to be outsiders in this civilization, and that's okay. The Bendas never tried to hide this from their children. True, they didn't tell them everything that was going on. A lot of this was not age appropriate, but the Benda children grew up knowing that they were not communist and that they stood against this corrupt social order because they were Christians and because of the views on liberty and democracy and decency that their parents had. That's what it meant to be a Benda. That was part of the identity of being a member of the Benda family. And this is what it has to mean to be a member of your own family. Your kids have to grow up with that knowledge that these memories constitute who they are. Now, this doesn't mean that they should be afraid of the world or hide out in the catacombs or anything like that, but it does mean that if they don't develop a strong sense of their identity as Orthodox Christians who are bearers of certain traditions and of a civilization, then they will be crushed by the power of the dominant anti-Christian culture. Fourth, I want to say a few words about the culture of the family. One of the great things about being Orthodox is that there really is no way, if you're doing this even half right, to keep the faith confined to Sunday mornings. I'll say more about this in tomorrow's talk, but I want to mention here the findings of a social anthropologist named Paul Carnerton, who wrote a little book called How Societies Remember. In it, he talked about the importance of holding a sacred story in common and enacting that sacred story in rituals that involve the body. That obviously is what we do in divine liturgy, and we do that better than any other Christian church. When I say better, I mean that we integrate our body more fully into worship than any other tradition. But it is also what we do or should do in our houses with our icons. It's what we do when we fast. It's what we do when we pray alone or together, when we make prostrations, all these things. The point is that orthodoxy is a way of life. It should be this way always and everywhere, but it is especially vital that we make it so in our own homes, in the culture of our own family, in our post, indeed, anti-Christian age. Along those lines, I emphasize something that might be a little strange to you, but it's something that we absolutely have to understand today. We are living through such a revolutionary epoch that language itself is even falsified. The ideologues who've gained control of our culture are hollowing out familiar words and replacing them with new ones that carry a highly ideological meaning. Love wins. Well, what is love? Well, you see where this is going. This form of propaganda not only changes the way we think about politics and contemporary life, but it also conditions what a culture judges to be worth remembering. This came up in a conversation I had in Warsaw when I was researching Live Not by Lies with a Polish historian named Paweł Skibinski. We were talking about how progressives in both Poland and the US use neutral sounding words like dialogue and tolerance in ways that to confuse and defeat people who are trying to defend tradition. And these progressives imbue other words and phrases like patriarchy or hierarchy or traditional family with negative connotations. Recalling life under communism, Professor Skibinski told me the people who lived only within such a linguistic sphere, who didn't know any other way to speak, they could really start believing in this way of using words. If a word carries with it negative baggage, it became impossible to have a discussion about the phenomenon, he said. Teaching current generations of college students who grew up in the post-communist era is challenging, he told me, because they don't have a natural immunity to the ideological abuse of language, something that people who grew up under communism learned. Professor Skibinski told me, for me, it's obvious. I remember this false use of language, but for our students, it's impossible to understand. So how do people keep hold of reality itself under communist conditions? How do they not know only, or how did they know not only what to remember, but how to remember it? The answer was to create distinct small communities, especially families and religious fellowships like this group of Orthodox homeschoolers, in which it was possible both to speak truthfully and to embody truth, where words meant things. Professor Skibinski said of these people who did this in Poland, they had social spaces where the real meaning of words was preserved. For me, it's less important to argue with such a view of the world, progressivism he meant, than to describe reality as it is. For example, our task is to show people what a normal monogamous family looks like, unquote. He's right about that. So even as we create cultural memories in our children in formal classroom instruction, whether it's around the kitchen table or something else in our homeschools, let's also remember that we have to live in ways in our daily lives, both within the house and outside the household, in ways that show our kids what truth is. The Benda children grew up hero worshiping their father because they saw how brave he was, and their mother too, in the face of the communists. And those were powerful forms of educating the children. They didn't have to sit down and be told what a hero was. They could see it in their father and their mother and their father and mother's friends who would come in and out of the Benda apartment in Prague because the apartment was around the corner from the secret police headquarters. And when people were going for interrogation there, they would often stop at the Bendas to be prayed for and to be coached in how to resist an interrogation. And on the way back, when they would be shaken up, sometimes they had been tortured, they would stop at the Bendas for more prayer and for comfort. The Benda children saw their parents behaving this way, and in that way, they knew what it meant to be a hero and what it meant to be a true Christian. I want to end by saying that simply by being homeschooling parents, you're teaching your children by word and example that it is critically important to be countercultural in a world that hates us and wants to destroy our memory of who we are and whose we are. Think of what it meant to be the Hebrews exiled in Babylon. They did not know how long they were going to be there, but they knew, because God spoke to them through the prophet Jeremiah, that the Lord had brought them there for a reason, and that he would eventually restore them to their home. Their task while in Babylon was not to forget who they were, even as they settled among the Babylonians. And to phrase it another way, God wanted them to keep the memory of who they were alive and who their God was, even as they lived among a foreign people. Think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the book of Daniel. You can't get more integrated into Babylonian society than to be servants of the king. But those three young Hebrew men never forgot who they were and who their God was. So when the king ordered them to worship a false idol, they chose the prospect of death before apostasy. The parents of those young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the communities in which they were raised, gave them cultural memory, that is, the faith, the worship of the true God embedded within cultural memory and practices, cultural practices that kept those memories alive and made them real in their minds. And that helped those young men to withstand the utmost persecution and to even be willing to give their lives as martyrs if that's what God asked of them. That's why there are Jewish communities alive today. If there are to be Orthodox Christian communities in America tomorrow, it will be because of what we parents have done for our children. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Rod. What a beautiful presentation you put together. And I suggest everybody, if you haven't read his book, please do so. There's a lot more. This is just a taste of the research that he's put together. Live not by lies there. I want to, real fast, before we get to questions, our Bishop Thomas, who oversees the Antiochian Archdiocese of Department of Homeschooling, and is with us. And I'm going to, let's see, how do I ask you to unmute? Okay, Sayedna, you should be able to speak now. Your blessing, please. Well, I don't know.
Bishop Thomas, good afternoon.
Hi, Sayedna, your blessing. Welcome.
Father Noah, how are you today?
Thank God.
What I've been able to listen to, I've been in and out of the sessions, including this one, and sitting in classes at St. Constantine's. So I'm very pleased with what I hear. And of course, we're always pleased with the work that Father Noah does with the Department of Homeschooling.
Thank you, Sayedna. Thank you for your prayers and your inspiration. So if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and type them in there. Father David, can you give us the drawing?
Yes, so we did the drawing for the book titled Thinking Orthodox by Dr. Jeannie Constantinou, and it is gifted to us from the Goldberry Bookshop, and you'll find that information in the conference booklet. The winner tonight is, and forgive me if I say it wrong, but Tino and Mikey Romeo are our winners, and we will be in touch with you to get you the copy of that book.
Thank you.
If I may, Father, I notice as I'm talking that just over my shoulder here, I have an icon of a rare icon in Orthodoxy of a father and a son saint. It's Saint Alexei Michev and his son Saint Sergei, both Orthodox priests, and it's really wonderful that they would be over my shoulder as I'm talking about this, because Father Alexei raised Father Sergei and his large family there in a poor parish in Moscow. He became a great starets of the Russian Church, and he had to raise them after alone because his wife died. Father Alexei died in 1923. The Soviets let Patriarch Tikhon out of prison to celebrate his funeral liturgy. And his son, Father Sergei, took the parish over there on Maraseka Street in Moscow. Father Sergei went on to die in the Gulag. The Soviets killed him in 1941 in the Gulag because he refused to submit. And they're now remembered by the Orthodox Church in Russia as saints. And Father Sergei learned what he learned at the foot of his father who was, his widowed father. And it's just what an amazing story. I didn't know anything about these men until I went to Butovo Field and prayed there at the church dedicated to the martyrs of Bolshevism, and saw icons of them. And I ended up going to their parish in Russia, in Moscow, to pray. And that's where I bought this icon you see there. And I carry it with me whenever I travel overseas, because I want to be the kind of father and the kind of son that they both were.
Thank you, Rod. The big question from last night, this is gonna maybe the Uber question. I got together with a bunch of the St. Emilia homeschool dads, and we kicked around some of the problems that kind of haunt us. And the big question was, we see in the lives of the saints, it's easy, of course, not easy, but it's clear. If somebody says, deny Christ, or I'm going to chop your head off or shoot you. It's a little bit more tricky. There's a lot of gray area. And how do we teach our children? And you gave some good examples of that, but how do we teach our children to see the shifting society, and, one lie leads to another lie, that kind of discernment, and that subtle logic that we have to be aware of.
Yeah, it's so hard because a lot of times people read my books and they want very clear a list of things here about do this, don't do that, and I don't feel comfortable doing that because frankly I think we have to take into consideration where people are in their own lives. I don't say that to be squishy, but I'll bring up an example. When I was in Poland, I spoke to a couple of Polish Catholic men who worked had really good jobs working for Western multinationals, in the Polish branch of Western multinationals. And they told me that these Western companies were compelling everybody to submit to Pride Week, LGBT Pride Week, things like that. And these dads said, what should we do? We don't want to persecute gay people at all, but, to affirm it like this violates our conscience. And, and I told them, I said, well, we can't live by lies, but I said, you should talk to your priest about this, because, I don't know what the situation is of your family, and I would hate for your children to become destitute because you followed the advice of an American writer who doesn't live where you are and doesn't understand what's going on with you. And that might seem cowardly to take that way out, but I'm really serious about it. I think that discernment like this has to happen within communities of prayer with our spiritual fathers, but also with our friends who are also serious about their faith. I think that one thing I'm thinking about a lot lately, as my oldest is 21 now and about to leave college in a year or two and get into the working world, is how to handle the whole pronouns thing, right? About if you're presented with someone who demands that you use certain pronouns that amount to speaking something that's a lie, well, what do you do? I want my children to know that you can't cross that line. That to me is a really bright line. But I don't know that I could condemn somebody else, another Orthodox father who taught his children that might be an acceptable compromise, but don't go farther than that. I think we have to. This is such a new situation that, as you said, and as the men you talked to last night said, Father Noah, that we're in such a new situation that nobody's holding a gun to our head as they did to the priest I tell about in Live Not by Lies, saying deny Christ or die. But we do end up practicing what I talked about in the book as ketman, as saying things we don't believe are true for the sake of going along to get along. I think one clear line that we can use is is if we're forced to say things that we don't believe are true, I think we should never do that. Solzhenitsyn said, never do that. It's one thing to keep your mouth shut. It's another thing to open it and speak a lie. I spoke to a young man, not an Orthodox man, an evangelical Christian, a college student who came through my city, Baton Rouge, a few weeks back, came to visit me and accompanied by an Orthodox teacher of his. And he said that he's in college at a major college back east. And he said, I'm ashamed to say that I've heard myself saying things that I didn't believe in class, because you have to say that you have to participate in class to get a good grade. But if you say something that violates progressive orthodoxy, then you'll bring down the whole class on top of your head. The young man said he realized now he should have just said what he believed, period. I said, well, that's progress. So maybe that is one good, a good line we can have there. Father Kirill Kaleda told me that we're not supposed to go out as Christians, as Orthodox Christians, and seek persecution. But if it comes to us, then we have to bear it as Christian men and women. I think that the line about never put yourself in a position to say what you know is false. And if you are, then be prepared to take the persecution for that. I wish I had said something like that to those Polish men, but you know, it's as you know, you're a pastor. It's a difficult pastoral thing. I mean, what can maybe I don't. You're talking to me. I'm not interviewing you, but what would you say, Father Noah, in a case like that?
Well, I obviously St. John Chrysostom said a priest has to have 1,000 eyes, both to kind of discern the situation properly, but to see how it's going to affect everybody else that is watching him as a leader. And one of my most important eyes is my wife, and the other one is my spiritual father, and another one is my bishop, and then a couple of people in the church and some clergy that I know and trust. And I run the issues by them. And you know, a couple of things that I thought, boy, this could be the hill that I have to die on. Father Mark in confession said, no, this is not. This is not the hill you're dying on. This is nothing. It's going to get much worse. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Save yourself for something worse.
Yeah,
Father
it's a
Noah.
matter of discernment. Discernment is not. It's not something you can look up in the books. It's something that has to come from lived experience, I think. And you know, I think it's something I don't think it's something, I know it's something that I and everybody I know who is serious about living their faith is going to have to exercise more and more. And this is why I talk about why it's so important to develop these small communities that Father Tomislav Kolakovich spoke of. Those communities of Christians would come together and they would really talk about things. They would not only pray, but they would talk about what it meant to be faithful in conditions, the actual conditions of society. And I find the more I have conversations with fellow believers, whether they're Orthodox or not, people are dying for this sort of thing because things are changing so quickly and people are so afraid. The sort of thing that you could say with no problem yesterday, tomorrow, it can mean your job.
This is Bishop Thomas. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you saying it. Thank you.
If I can interrupt for a minute, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be rude. But Father Noah, I want to emphasize what you said when you quoted St. John Chrysostom about it having many eyes. It's very, very important that the people that are joined together with you on this in this conference, as well as those people that are traditional Christians, we share eyes and ears. That as a matter of fact, we see something that is going to be very dangerous, okay, to our salvation, that we use the internet and texting and whatever other thing people do to communicate to our advantage, okay? And we sanctify it so that we can alert others. Those eyes many eyes that he's speaking about are the eyes of the people that are listening to this, that are serious about their salvation. So I want to encourage everyone to share not only in the techniques of homeschooling, but as a matter of fact, to share and the angels that guard us, but also to share in the attacks that might come upon us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sayed. If you,
Camilla,
Rod, if you,
yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry, go ahead, Rod. Sorry.
I was going to say, Camilla Bendova told me that one of the important things to being a Christian under persecution in communist Czechoslovakia was not to judge those who broke under torture. She said that, and Solzhenitsyn said something similar in the Gulag Archipelago, that eventually everybody breaks because the communists were so merciless that part of holding the Christian community together was being quick to be merciful to those who collapsed under torture. So I hope that none of us ever have to endure torture, but we do need to also learn how to be merciful to those who make decisions that are different from ours, but it may be wrong, but I always want to try to lead with mercy.
Rod, I will summarize a few of the questions that are in the chat box for you. They're kind of covering both ends of the spectrum. What do we do if we're in an area where there aren't many Orthodox or any other Orthodox that we know of families to create kind of these Benedict groups? On the other hand, there's questions about, well, should we be looking to kind of network our individual groups into some kind of a larger network of kind of Orthodox Christian underground, so to speak? So kind of both ends of the spectrum.
Sure. Well, one thing I found in our local Christian hybrid homeschool classroom discussion group, school, it's non-denominational. There are not enough Orthodox people here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana to put together a school. But in fact, our priest, Father Joshua, teaches at this school. But it is a mere, like a C.S. Lewis mere Christianity school. Most of the people there are evangelical. There are some Catholics, and we're an Orthodox family who's there. And we find that this works. There's really because there's so few Orthodox here, there's really no other way for us to do it. And one of the things I found in talking to the people I interviewed, whether they're Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant, who went through Soviet or communist persecution, they said that they realized under persecution, when they were in prison, they developed this sort of ecumenism of the Gulag, because they realized that they weren't there because they were Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant. They were there because they were followers of Jesus Christ who would not submit to the tyrant. And I think in a similar way, we can make common cause and need to make common cause with Christians from other churches who are people of goodwill, who don't ask us to compromise our beliefs. They shouldn't have to compromise theirs, but we can stand together and support each other and network among each other. This is something that I'm trying to encourage people to do, is build these networks across church lines, too, across state lines, even across national boundaries, because we are going to need it. I think about Father Kolakovich and his genius work that he did, and his spiritual children are still alive in Slovakia today. And I mean, it was something that nobody except him foresaw. So when I do my travels now, I'm about to go to Budapest next week. I'll be working there this summer, but I'll also be doing traveling throughout Europe to promote Live Not by Lies. It's going to be out in France, Spain, Italy, and some of the Eastern Bloc countries this summer. I have the same message I had when I took the Benedict option over there, telling people to make these networks, make these friendships, pray with each other, talk to each other, because when there are too few of us to stand alone. And this whole, and I'll talk more about this tomorrow, but this whole principle was something I brought out with the Benedict option, but talking to the believers who stood up under communism really cemented it for me. The Benda family, I keep going back to them, but they said that they were the only Christians in their circle there in Prague. And I asked Camilla about that. I'm like, was that hard for you? Because I knew she and her husband were really strict Catholics. And a lot of the people in the dissident community were hippies. And, let's just say they didn't follow a Christian moral scheme in their private lives. And she said, look, Rod, of course we didn't approve of what they did, but when you're in a situation like we were in, where everybody is afraid to stand up to the government. When you found someone who was willing to be courageous enough to stand up and say, this is wrong and I will not consent to this, then you knew that you were their friend and their ally no matter what, and they knew that you would be theirs. This is why these people who normally, in normal circumstances, would have hated us as Christians, knew that we were their best friends. So this is the situation that we're moving into now is going to force us to find friends and allies in places we wouldn't normally have done so.
Rod, we have a lot of wonderful questions coming in. Can you spare 5 more minutes?
Yeah, 5 or 10 more minutes, I can do that. And then I'll have to go out and force myself to build this chicken coop.
So, question from Fotini. Thank you, Fotini. Wonderful question. If you compare a situation with communism, what stage do you think we are in? Is this the beginning? She asks.
Well, you know, people who call me alarmist about this stuff, they are taking as their example of totalitarianism the experience of the 20th century, Stalinism, or Orwell's 1984, which is based on Stalinism. And I say that that's completely false. If that's your idea of what totalitarianism is, you're going to miss what's actually happening. In fact, I got the idea for this book, Live Not by Lies, starting back in 2015, when I began to hear from people in America who had grown up in communist countries and come to America as immigrants and refugees. They're all starting to say that the things they see happening in America today remind them of when communism first arrived in their countries. I thought that was alarmist too when I heard it, but the more I kept hearing this from these people and the more I would listen to them and investigate what they were saying, I understood what they were talking about. And what they meant specifically was, when you have a situation where people start to lose their jobs because of what they say and what they believe, then this is what happened when communism first came in. Losing jobs, when people have to be afraid to speak what's on their mind. They're afraid they'll become social pariahs. When mobs come after them for what they believe and what they say. These are all signs that things are turning. I think what's going to end up happening, though, is we are going to face something in this country more like what the Chinese are doing with their social credit system. I'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow, probably, but very quickly, in China now, everything happens online. It's an almost entirely cashless society, where if you want to participate in the economy, you do it with your smartphone or you do it on your laptop. The government tracks everything that happens on everybody's laptop and smartphone. It goes into a database. And it is also merged with facial recognition software and cameras on the street and studying GPS coordinates and all of this, to where they have a picture within the computers of what everybody is doing and who everybody's friends are. They don't have to send the secret police around to spy on you. It's all there in the database. And what they do is assign each person a social credit rating. It's like a normal credit rating that tells you whether you're creditworthy, can borrow money. The social credit rating basically says whether or not you're a good citizen. So if you end up doing socially positive things in the eyes of the communist government, like downloading the speeches of Xi Jinping, well, then you get a higher rating, and that gives you access to more things in society. Your kids can go to the better universities. You can travel more, that sort of thing. But if you do things that are socially negative, like going to church or hanging out with other people who have lower social credit scores, it's going to bring your credit score down too. And if it gets down low enough, you won't be able to buy or sell in China. Now, if you know anything about the book of Revelation, that should set off alarm bells. Well, here in America, we do the same thing. All this information is collected about us, and it's done completely legally, and it's not done by the government. It's done by big business. It's done by Amazon, by Google. Every time you install an app on your phone, if you don't read the small print, but that gives companies the right to collect all kinds of information about you that they use to detect what they can sell you. I mean, a lot of people have had the experience of being in the grocery store and seeing something pop up on their phone about something they were talking about 30 minutes ago. Siri really is listening to you. This is not conspiracy theory. I remember talking in Prague to Camilla Benda about her experience, and she said that I don't understand why Americans and young people in her own country give so much of their information over to these companies through their smartphones. She said, if you had been through what we went through in this country, you would never do that. You would understand that there's no such thing as somebody else collecting information about you in a neutral way. And she pointed out on the wall, like little scars on the wall in the paint, where she and her late husband, had pulled out the wires from when the communists had bugged her. The secret police had bugged their apartment. Her point is simply this. She said that people today, by giving over so much data about who they are and what they do and who they hang out with to these companies, are setting themselves up for persecution. I believe she's right. And I believe that within, 5-10 years or so, we're going to see clearly everything moving toward a social credit system here. One of the readers of my blog who works in the tech field sent me something from a trade journal where it was just a neutral article saying, get ready for the social credit system. Here are some things you can do to get ready for this. And they thought it was a good thing, a way to make sure that only the good people, the safe people, the non-deplorable people could have access to sporting events and fun things like that. This is how they're going to force people to conform, but by limiting our access to sporting events, to good jobs, and so on and so forth, based on what we do online, what we say online, and where we hang out and who we hang out with.
One of the things that I've been reflecting on is we're just so used to our comforts and our conveniences that we've shackled ourselves. We're slaves to that, and we're tied into, big tech and big sports and big data and big medicine and big everything. We've lost ourselves in our autonomy in the creature comforts and the conveniences and all of these things. And it takes a lot of courage to wake up from that and to say, wait a second, I can live like I lived when I grew up, and I can show my children a different way to live and maybe have a simpler life, so that I don't have to be a slave, not to the Joneses, but to not just Uncle Sam, but Uncle everybody.
Well, one thing I don't want to get too far into tomorrow's talk, but one thing I'm going to talk about that I learned from the Christian dissidents under communism is the importance of being willing to suffer. And it's not just suffer, persecution or something like that. That's important, but it's a simple matter of being more ascetic for the sake of truth. And those who would control us will have the power they do over us because we can't stand not to do it. I mean, I mentioned to you about Amazon controlling 80% of the book market. That didn't happen overnight. I buy a lot of books from Amazon. They're great at what they do. But now that they have that kind of control in the market and they're exercising it to make sure a certain kind of book will never be published, you wonder about the cost of that convenience and cheap books, because we're paying a price. And look, after everything I've told you about handing over data and all that, I still have a smartphone. I have to use it. I have to use it for my job, but there is a price to be paid. I was talking to an Orthodox Christian who was retired from military intelligence and got in touch with me. And he said, everything you said in your book about how all this information is being gathered, I can tell you from my own experience and things I've seen in my work that it's true. And he told me that he's also starting to think of ways he can help churches through the persecution that he believes definitely is coming, how he can help Orthodox churches protect themselves from electronic surveillance and things like that. These are crazy things to talk about, but we have to talk about them. This is a man who is a faithful Christian whose family immigrated to America as refugees from communist Russia, who is now going to use his own experience in military intelligence to help his fellow believers protect themselves from the kind of thing that his ancestors ran away from. I mean, it's just insane, but this is where we are. And this is what you mentioned earlier, Father Noah, that some of the folks in your church read Live Not by Lies and got depressed by it and disillusioned by it. Good. We need to be disillusioned and disillusioned about how safe we are. Solzhenitsyn warned that this is how we make ourselves vulnerable. He said the people around the world think that what happened in Russia can never happen in their country. They're wrong about that. And if we should not become paralyzed with fear, but we should use this awareness of what we're going to face in a way to build up our internal resources and to prepare our communities for what's to come.
Rod, thank you.